So the night before, I plan on making sourdough. I make myself a leaven, which is gonna be like a second activation for your starter to be added to your dough in a bit. If it hasn't doubled in size, I'm gonna put it in the oven with the oven light, which will add a little bit of warmth, but won't cook your leaven at all, and it'll help get it to rise. If your house is warm enough, usually you don't have to do this step, but this will just kind of help speed up the process. It might take a little while. It took a little bit longer because our house was pretty cold the last couple of days. So I left it in there for probably about 2 to 3 hours. And by the time I went and checked on it at the end, it had doubled quite a bit. So it was ready to be used. Now you're gonna start weighing out your ingredients. I use the scale. Some recipes will use either cups. It kind of depends on what recipe you're following. I use a bread flour and wheat flours. It depends on the recipe you're following, which ingredients you're gonna use. I use 800 grams of a white flour, a bread flour, and then 200 grams of wheat flour. I really like this brand. It's a stone milled flour, so the flavor is really great, but there are so many different flours that you can use. It just depends on whatever recipe you choose to follow. After I have my flour all measured out, I'll add in my filtered water, and then I will add in my leaven. You want it to be super bubbly and active looking before adding it into your sourdough mixture.
I'm getting mighty tired of your trifling ways and of listening to that jackass bray.
Now you're gonna start incorporating all your ingredients together to kind of make a shaggy mass. It's gonna be kind of very sticky. It's not gonna really look like dough, and that's totally fine, but you just wanna make sure all your flour is completely incorporated before you let it sit. Once you've mixed it completely and you can see there's no flour, we're gonna let it sit for about 2 hours. This is called autolyse. 2 hours max, no longer. If you have, press for time, let it sit for a minimum of 30 minutes. And this is gonna help the gluten strands to form. After your 2 hours, you're going to measure out 20 grams of salt, and you're going to add that to your shaggy dough mixture and start to incorporate it all together. You'll notice after you start slowly mixing it in, it's going to start feeling more like dough. The salt is starting to absorb a lot of that moisture, which kind of gives it that dough-like texture, and just work it in a few times until it starts pulling away from the bowl and isn't as sticky as when you first started. Now we're gonna let our dough sit for an hour at room temperature, and every 30 minutes we are going to do a stretch and fold. There's different ways to do it. Some will fold it just on top of each other. I like to kind of stretch it up out of the bowl and then fold it down on top of itself about 3 to 4 times, and then I let it sit for 30 minutes, come back, repeat until I've done it at least 4 times.
What you mean, Miss Elsa?
After after your last stretch and fold, you're going to make sure you've tucked your dough seam side down into your bowl to kind of make sure you've trapped in some air while it ferments overnight. I like to put a towel on it, and I put it in my oven just to ensure that nothing's going to get to it while it sits. And then in the morning I pull it out, and by then it should have definitely risen quite a bit. As you can see, there's lots of air bubbles and pockets, which is awesome, and it's doubled in size, which is a good thing. Now I'm going to scrape the dough out of the bowl onto a floured surface, and this is where I'm going to split it now into 2 separate loaves. And then I will shape it onto the counter and let it rest for 20 minutes before I do a final shaping, putting it into their baskets.
When you press me to your our world where roses bloom. When you speak, angel, sing from above. Everyday void seems
For the final shaping, I will stretch all the sides into the middle, and then from the top side, I will start to kind of stitch down the seam, and then I will take the bottom and start to roll it, almost like a roll, essentially, and make sure it's super tight as I do it. I then pinch the sides in to kind of trap in all that air before I tuck it into the basket to rest. Now that they're both in the baskets, I'm going to cover them with some tea towels and place them in the fridge to do a final proofing. Usually it's about 3 to 4 hours, maybe shorter. In this time period, they're going to do a little bit more rising. And when they do, that's when you know they're ready. Now you're going to want to preheat your oven and whatever you choose to bake your bread in to 400 degrees. And then you will pull out one of your doughs that's finished proofing and place it on some parchment paper, not wax paper. I've learned that the hard way. And then you will take your dough and flip it seam side down onto your parchment paper. Then carefully remove the dough from the basket. You're going to get yourself a lame, or I use just a blade from an X-Acto knife, and I will score it. You want to have a nice big score down the center of it. That's going to help any trapped air so your bread doesn't explode while it's baking. Then you can kind of create designs. People get a little crazy and will put, flowers, leaves, whatever. I usually will just little hash marks of it, and then it's good to go. Now you'll remove the baking vessel out of the oven, and you'll carefully put your parchment paper and your bread into it, put the lid on, and place it back in the oven. And then you're going to reduce your heat to 360 degrees. Let it bake for about 45 minutes, then remove the lid off of it and put it back in for another 20-25 minutes. Once it's done baking, you can then remove it from the oven. I like to let it cool for quite a bit before I start to slice into it because it's still kind of baking. You want to kind of keep that heat trapped inside to help get any moisture that's still in there to evaporate. Then once it's set and cooled, you can cut into it and enjoy it.